was a 12-year-old Black American junior high school student in a predominantly white school, I was chosen for an important task due to my reading skills and high diction. Well, the task was to read a eulogy to honor a very important white man who had just died. I, of course, had no idea who this man really was and the suffering he had caused for many. It was only later that I came to know the true John Edgar Hoover, the former head of the FBI and the mind behind COINTELPRO. Hello and welcome to Hidden Files. I'm Marzieh Hashimi. Well, the man known as J. Edgar Hoover had been the first director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and he'd headed the organization for almost 50 years. He was instrumental in carrying out a deadly program by the FBI called COINTELPRO, which stood for Counterintelligence Program, and existed from the 1950s until the 1970s. Now, this clandestine program was carried out against American activists and organizations.
COINTELPRO was an FBI operation established in the 50s by J. Edgar Hoover to target African Americans who were fighting for justice and equality. He targeted Dr. King, he targeted Malcolm X, and over 80% of the targets of COINTELPRO were members of the Black Panther Party.
And this is what they did during the next 14 years, from federal agents all the way down to local police. They would spy on civil rights leaders and others, which was, of course, illegal. Then they carried out assassinations, both physical and character assassinations, to stifle movements such as the Black Panther Party. Now, in order to justify these assassinations, the federal agents would actually fabricate evidence, set up crime scenes by staging false flag attacks, incite riots, and engage in many other criminal and inhumane activities. Now, the groups targeted by the FBI were quite diverse, from anti-war activists to Black nationalists, but none, absolutely none, was targeted quite in the same way as the Black Panthers.
J. Edgar Hoover was FBI director for almost 50 years. It is said he had enough information on just about anyone to blackmail them, even presidents of the country. His number one enemy was the Black Panther Party, as he sought to prevent unity in the Black community. As FBI director, Hoover oversaw COINTELPRO and ordered agents to destroy, disrupt, and neutralize the Panthers. In 1969, U.S. domestic intelligence budget was $7.4 billion. There were 295 operations by the FBI against Black groups. 233 of these operations were directed at the Panthers. 28 members of the Panthers were murdered by the FBI that year.
One of the main individuals who was targeted by COINTELPRO was Fred Hampton. Now, Fred was a charismatic young law student of the Chicago branch of the Black Panthers. He was a dedicated revolutionary and orator.
We work with anybody and form coalition with anybody that has revolution on their mind. We're not a racist organization because we understand that racism is an excuse used for capitalism. And we know that racism is a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people. And we're going to have to put it back in the hands of the people. All power to the people. That's saying that no matter what color you are, there's only two classes. And that's saying there's a class over here and there's a class over there. And the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off its back, because this is lower, this is upper. This is the oppressed, this is the oppressor. This is the exploited, this is the exploiter. And these people in this class have divided themselves. They say, I'm black and I hate white people. I'm white and I hate black people. I'm Latin American and I hate hillbillies. I'm hillbilly and I hate Indians. So we fight amongst each other.
Well, I'd like to welcome to Hidden Files, Johanna Fernandez.
Johanna Fernandez is Associate Professor of History at Baruch College of the City University of New York and author of The Young Lords, A Radical History. Professor Fernandez is the writer and executive producer of the film Justice on Trial, The Case of Mumia Abu-Jamal.
Thanks so much for being with us here on Hidden Files. Now, there's so much evidence that the actions taken under COINTELPRO were illegal. So can you tell us why no one was ever prosecuted for these crimes?
Well, the COINTELPRO program, or COINTELPRO, is an extra-legal organization of repression developed by the American government. It's like the CIA. The CIA is engaged in all manner of homicidal activity around the world, but it's an extra-legal organization. So that's a great question. Essentially, we would need a movement exposing, for example, the atrocity we saw with the assassination of Fred Hampton on December 4th, 1969. He was assassinated Latin American dictatorship style in the streets of Chicago, actually in his own bed. And you talked about the relationship between political prisoners, their imprisonment, and sometimes the assassination of Black radicals. Well, COINTELPRO sent an agent into the organization, the Black Panther Party, of which Fred Hampton was the leader in Chicago. And that agent identified precisely where Fred Hampton slept and where he would be that night that he was assassinated. And he was assassinated by COINTELPRO that was working with the Chicago Police Department. And the question is, what happened to that agent? That agent was so bereft, he was so destroyed by what he had facilitated that he committed suicide. COINTELPRO stands for the Counterintelligence Program of the FBI. And it was developed by the FBI at the height of the Cold War. And in the 1960s, it was deployed against all of the activists of that period, but in particular, it was deployed against civil rights and Black Power activists. And what we see happening in the 1960s is that there's a moral panic created by politicians that uses the term law and order to criminalize Black protest. And if you look at the history of the 1960s, you'll note that there are various campaigns to free Huey Newton, to free Angela Davis, and to free protesters, activists who were being imprisoned. Even Martin Luther King, if you remember, wrote that famous letter from the Birmingham jail because those who were fighting for their freedom to expand the notion of American democracy were criminalized and imprisoned. So the question is, what is the relationship between political imprisonment, the FBI's COINTELPRO, and mass incarceration? Well, that term, law and order, was the ideological linchpin used by the far right, but also by Democratic politicians to criminalize radicals, protesters, the urban rebellions. And then in the 1980s and 90s, upon that project launched initially in the 1960s against Black radicals, you see the development and the increase and expansion of this hyper incarceration of Black people, but also other racialized communities.
Unbelievable. Well, can you tell us about the connection in general between COINTELPRO and political prisoners?
Connection between COINTELPRO and political prisoners, absolutely. COINTELPRO essentially investigated, identified those involved in political action, and targeted their organizations, and disrupted them and made it easy or facilitated the criminalization and imprisonment of activists in the 60s, Black Americans in particular. Very important is the relationship between the imprisonment of Black radicals or the repression of the movements for Black freedom and mass incarceration. The fact that there isn't a sustained movement in the United States for Black freedom means that the government can get away with this atrocity. Has 5% of the world's population, but imprisons 25% of the world's prisoners. We have a situation in which people are framed, not just political prisoners and those who fight for freedom, but people are framed in the streets by the police regularly, and folks are also over. And if you look at the people who are in prison, all of them are poor, working class people. And by one statistic, the average wage of those imprisoned at the time of their imprisonment was $10,000.
Wow.
Is not a salary or that is sustainable in the United States, not even. So poverty and of course racism are at the root of this crisis.
Well, in one of my documentaries, I actually interviewed Fred Hampton's wife, Akuya Najiri, who was lying in bed beside him when the FBI and Chicago police opened fire with about 100 rounds. Imagine this. Well, let's listen to her firsthand account of what took place and also from their son, Fred Hampton Jr.
Jail, I might be anywhere, but when I leave, you can remember I said with the last words on my lips that I am a revolutionary, and you're going to have to keep on saying that.
Fred Hampton was a 21-year-old chairman of the Illinois Black Panthers. The Black Panther Party was striving for the independence of blacks and implemented many social programs.
December 4th, 1969, exactly 45 years ago, Chicago police came in Illinois Bell phone truck. They blocked the entire block off. They pulled occupants from outside their home.
My name is Akua Jerry, formerly known as Deborah Johnson. I'm the widow of Chairman Fred Hampton.
Can you run me through that, exactly what happened?
Well, on the night of December 3rd,
someone came into the room, started shaking the chairman. Said, Chairman, wake up, the pigs was laughing.
The pigs had knocked on the front door, and Mark Clark said, who's there? And the response came back, Tommy. Mark Clark said, Tommy who? Tommy gun. They kicked the door in and just started shooting.
And I saw bullets coming from, it looked like the front of the apartment, from the kitchen area.
I could see like sparks going in front of the doorway, like shots. I could smell cordite from all the gunshots, and our bed was vibrating like this.
They kept calling out, stop shooting, stop shooting. We have a pregnant woman, a pregnant sister in here. At that time, I was 8.5 to 9 months pregnant. My baby was to be delivered in 2 weeks.
The pregnant sister was my mother-to-be, then Deborah Johnson, now Akua Jerry. She's 8.5 months pregnant with me at the time.
Anybody that's been under gunshot know that 5 minutes is 5 hours. You think it's forever. And I found out later that this whole assassination took a total of maybe 15 minutes.
Heard the pig say, he's barely alive, he'll barely make it. They started shooting again. I heard the sister scream. They stopped shooting. Pig said, he's good and dead now. The pigs running around and laugh, and they were really happy, you know, talking about Chairman Fred is dead. I never saw Chairman Fred again.
And I remember saying to myself in my head, you better not stumble, you better not fall, because they will shoot you and say that you're trying to get a gun. So I'm trying to walk, I'm very pregnant, and we're coming out, and there were 2 lines of pigs I had to walk through. One of them grabbed my robe open, and they started laughing, and they said, "What you know, we got a broad here." They grabbed me by the hair and slung me into the kitchen area.
As soon as Sergeant Daniel Groth and officers James Davis, who were leading our men, announced their office, occupants of the apartment attacked them with shotgun fire. The officers immediately took cover. The occupants continued firing at our policemen from several rooms within the apartment. Thereafter, 3 times, Sergeant Groth ordered all his men to cease firing and told the occupants to come out with their hands up. Each time, one of the occupants replied, "Shoot it out," and continued firing at the police officers.
People came through the apartment because they didn't believe the reenactment that then State's Attorney Edward Hanran was doing, where he talked about how the police were met, his brave police officers were met with a barrage of gunfire from the vicious Black Panthers. And people lined up all around the block to come through and see. And through the state's own sticks, they put these sticks in the holes. Through the trajectories of the bullets, they could see 90% of the shots were aimed at the head where Chairman Fred.
Well, let's cross back over to Johanna and listen to more of her comments on all of this. Well, Johanna, what happened actually to social activism for change in the U.S.?
Well, movements are not forever, and there's always an ebb and flow. And part of what we've seen is a tremendous uprising, among the largest uprisings in American history following the George Floyd murder by police. And of course, this happened at a very specific moment when there was a lockdown in this country because of the pandemic, and when many people witnessed the inability of the American government to respond to something like a pandemic. So there was a sense of powerlessness. And then we have this horrific atrocity. And there was an uprising of epic proportion. However, movements are different than uprisings and mass demonstrations. Movements are accompanied by the emergence of organizations and sustained organizing and struggle in the streets that essentially create a strategy, that have some kind of theory of how change can happen that is then deployed. And that we haven't seen, in part because part of what COINTELPRO did was to eviscerate organizations and their leaders, and disconnected an older generation of activists and organizers with future generations. So COINTELPRO eroded the tradition of organizing and protest in this country. And so what we've seen in the last 40, 50 years in the main has been mass angry protests that have come and gone.
Well, thanks so much for being with us, Johanna Fernandez. Well, we've just seen a tip of the iceberg while looking at the effects of COINTELPRO. Some of the best potential leaders were assassinated. Some had to flee in exile, and others are still incarcerated today after spending decades in prison. Well, this is the best way to destroy any movement. You remove the head, and then basically you have a headless body. Correct information and education are key. That is the reason that education was always one of the main goals of the Black Panthers. They wanted to teach the kids their history. Well, unfortunately, as a 12-year-old, I didn't have the opportunity to be taught my own history. I didn't know the man, J. Edgar Hoover, whose obituary I was reading had been one of the most ruthless enemies of civil rights and other minority movements in the United States. Well, the effects of COINTELPRO is still very much alive. And next week, we will look at political prisoners in the United States and how COINTELPRO was fundamental in having prisoners incarcerated for 4 and 5 decades. Thank you so much for being with us right here at Hidden Files.